Life in the American South was as controversial as its industry post-Civil War. In the face of defeat against the American Union, there was a sense of stubbornness towards accepting Northern cultures, including the construction of factories within a mostly agricultural society. To describe how the culture of the American South in these times were open to allowing these factories to be built, the condition of the people living in the South must be analyzed, what allowed industry to spread in the American South, and what effect it had on the people. What should be understood is that industrialization in American society had widespread influence. The following should help show that it may have been their only choice to recover. The American South had its own strengths that made it a formidable confederacy during the Civil War. Prior to the losses they endured, they were holders of the title of King Cotton, which provided a great economic advantage. But during the Civil War, the Union had enlisted the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed enslaved persons from all lands they claimed for the duration of the war in the South. This was a strategic move as to affect their economy, for if any land was reclaimed by the American South, they wouldn't have the workers to uphold their economic standing. Going into the Reconstruction era, this led to a great deal of bias towards African Americans, and poor American whites as well, as strength and superiority became important in a region that had wanted to overcome oppression of its former federal government. There would be a series of African American communities sprouting throughout the South, as many freed people would be able to reconnect with their family and friends traded or sold in the past by slave masters. Some would stay close to plantations with nowhere to go, and or if farming was all that they knew, what to do. In the first figure shown on the screen is a depiction of African American migration patterns throughout the South. But not only did the loss of slavery affect the once strong agriculture of the American South, the violence that took place on battlefields had torn up the land. With some African Americans fighting on the side of the Union, this only led to more prejudice in this era, mostly blaming African Americans for their loss and their destabilizing state. Agriculture was trying to be recovered through sharecropping, and yet even in these careers, African Americans could not find equality, whether it's from the communities or from payment from their bosses. The relevance of these facts is to show that socially and structurally, the American South was in a poor condition. There would be Northern military installations in their governments to prevent further rebellion, which only furthered hate towards the North and their cultures. The Freedmen Bureau, meant for assisting in equal rights for African Americans in the South, had been met with little effect on influence to the Southern culture. The Bureau also sent what the Southerners had given the name of carpetbaggers to try to offer assistance from the North. As you can see in Figure 2, ruthless battlefields were still common. It would be more of a social rejection of Northern ideas than of government, since they were in a state that required to be rebuilt. It is because of this overall resistant lifestyle that would leave one to question how Northern industry was able to advance southwards. But once the Civil War was over, much of what would have been rich land for farming had been destroyed. It would be after this war that both sides of America had entered economic depression, which only further pushed Southern governments to acquire supplies from the North, despite the humiliation it could have brought. Even the North found some desperation too, to recover its wealth. In the film titled The Civil War Economy, the government again started issuing paper money called greenbacks. Greenbacks had to be used for the payment of debts. So jobs of the Northern culture may have been necessary to rise out of this depression. Factories and the mines needed to keep these factories fueled did offer payment, which did have an appeal of workers of lower classes in such a struggling society. There would still be workplace bias, and in a society that has been mostly divided racially, this idea may not have been as appealing. The Freedmen's Bureau, however, would have been dismantled by the end of the Reconstruction era, leaving no federal aid to be found in the southern area of America. Experienced factory workers weren't as common in the American South when it came to machine operating. Educating workers of how to run Northern machinery would have to be common. Despite the difficulties in between, the promises of success in tough times for the side of the country made the offerings of economic success too tempting. With much of southern land destroyed, industrialists saw them as perfect places to build on top of with factories. There were New Deal Southerners who would embrace the ideas of industrialization, but they did not make up the majority of voices in the American South. Although reluctant, many Southerners would just have to live with the rise of industry if they ever wanted to improve. It would be a begrudging shuffle to allow the South to have northern industry spread, and the industrial world of America would have just as equal effect as it did have on the people of the North as it would on the South. It remains true that the American North had implemented a framing of vilification upon Southerners, only further pushing the mood of shame that the American South already had for failing to defeat the North and feeling as if they were losing a way of life. Along with the reluctance to move into factories for work, they would be exposed to the lack of security within factories. With no federal requirements on expectations for work or compensation or treatment, factories would prove just as equally of a dangerous place as it was in the North. Machinery could have been deafening, repairing the machinery could have costed people limbs, along with all sorts of health effects, without the owners of the factory ever having to see governmental consequences. And if a worker was seriously injured, they could have likely been fired by their bosses. Labor unions formed in the North as did in the South. Common purpose of forming strikes, to have their voices heard, and to at least gain better pay for the risk they're putting themselves in. But it would start becoming common that local police or even the United States military would have been called on by factory officials to break the crowds. If riots became violent, prisoners of these outbreaks could have been executed or killed on the spot if federal forces fired into crowds. The Haymarket bombing would be such an example where union members were executed for their violent protests, being among the accused for using bombs. What these labor unions still provided to the American South, however, was a sense of community in the world under the will of monopolists. Organizations like the Knights of Labor and the Granges would have provided benefits for members within the North or South. Of course, some of these labor unions would have racial bias on who joined, and those that would have had open arms for all races, unfortunately, would not have lasted very long. What most of these labor unions provided commonly were lower prices at specific locations, while at the same time having the risk of being blacklisted by factory superiors. While this was immoral, factories weren't an uncommon place for unlawful practices to take place. Children still could have been hired for factory work, and even when this was banned, some factories would still try getting away with labor from them by hiding them during inspections. All people, families, including children, would have to find some form of work in order to help improve the economic situation. And yet, despite these effects that American industry would bring upon the American South, the region would have to give way to its nationwide influence, and can be argued that it still has that effect in the modern world. What happened to the American South was very conflicting. There had been mistreatment on both the part of the Southerners and the factory owners towards other people. Loyalty to one another is what the American South relied on in face of continuous change within their homelands. This can come into the form of brotherhood with fellow Southerners or labor unions, although both potentially have questionable morals. Prejudice would continue throughout the American South, affecting the career and safety of African Americans, whether at work or in their own communities. If the factories weren't dangerous enough, they still provided a means to profit from what was lost in the Civil War. Many would not have approved of industrialization if they had the power to resist it, but it was necessary in the end. This debt would influence the actions of Americans for many years to come in their near future. These factories promised swift production to bring economics back from the brink of a complete fall. The world of industry could not hide its negatives from either side of the country throughout Reconstruction and into the Gilded Age, but support and security could be found within numbers, as this shows. Overall, the effect that American industry had on the American South was negative, but to answer the reason why it spread into the region regardless was out of necessity to make the best of what they had. Of course, in the near future, it would not remain completely war-torn, but social effects of the American South would not be resolved for many years to come. Now, hopefully, there is a better understanding of why the American South acted as it did in the face of industrialization, and what's here can possibly bring evidence to find further improvement in their future in the modern world.